Hello. FIFA International Match 2025, results last night. Tunisia draw with Mauritania 1-1, St. Martin lost to Anguilla 1-2. FIFA International Match 2025 kickoff times are based on the latest information. Please verify. November 12th 8 p.m. UTC plus or minus 0, Barbados vs Bonaire, Cuba vs St. Lucia, Dominica vs St. Martin, 9:30 p.m. Bahamas vs Anguilla, November 12th 11 p.m. Antigua and Barbuda vs Aruba, St. Kitts and Nevis vs St. Martin, November 13th 12 a.m. Cayman Islands vs British Virgin Islands, Dominican Republic vs St. Vincent and the Grenadines, November 13th 7:30 p.m. UTC 7, Thailand vs Singapore, 9 p.m. UTC 8, Hong Kong vs Cambodia, 8 p.m. UTC 6, Bangladesh vs Nepal, 5:30 p.m. UTC 1, Algeria vs Zimbabwe, November 13th 5 p.m. Coordinated Universal Time UTC plus or minus 0, Czech Republic vs San Marino, Iran vs Cape Verde, Lithuania vs Israel, North Macedonia vs Latvia, November 14th 7:20 p.m. Japan Time UTC 9, Japan vs Ghana, 8 p.m. Korea Time UTC 9, South Korea vs Bolivia, 1 p.m. UTC plus or minus 0, Burkina Faso vs Niger, Comoros vs Namibia, Egypt vs Algeria, Oman vs Sudan, 3 p.m. UTC plus or minus 0, Kenya vs Equatorial Guinea, Angola vs Argentina, Saudi Arabia vs Ivory Coast, November 14th 5 p.m. UTC plus or minus 0, Uzbekistan vs Egypt, Tunisia vs Jordan, 6 p.m. Morocco vs Mozambique, November 15th 12 a.m. Grenada vs US Virgin Islands, November 15th 2 a.m. Venezuela vs Australia, November 15th 11 a.m. UTC plus or minus 0, Libya vs Mauritania, 5 p.m. South Africa vs Zambia, 6 p.m. Lesotho vs Malawi, 8 p.m. Brazil vs Senegal, Kuwait vs Tanzania, November 15th 5 p.m. UTC plus or minus 0, Uganda vs Chad, 8 p.m. Barbados vs Aruba, Dominica vs St. Martin, 9:30 p.m. Bahamas vs British Virgin Islands, 10 p.m. United States vs Paraguay, November 15th 11 p.m. UTC plus or minus 0, Guyana vs Bonaire, St. Martin vs Belize, St. Vincent and the Grenadines vs St. Lucia, November 16th 12 a.m. Cayman Islands vs Anguilla, Colombia vs New Zealand, Martinique vs Cuba, November 16th 1 a.m. Mexico vs Uruguay, November 17th 2 p.m. UTC plus or minus 0, Chad vs Mozambique, 3 p.m. Egypt vs Algeria, 4 p.m. Comoros vs Namibia, 5 p.m. Finland vs Andorra, November 18th 7:15 p.m. Japan Time UTC 9, Japan vs Bolivia, 8 p.m. GC 9, South Korea vs Ghana, 11 a.m. UTC plus or minus 0, Benin vs Burkina Faso, Jordan vs Mali, Venezuela vs Canada, 2 p.m. UTC plus or minus 0, Lesotho vs Malawi, 3 p.m. Kenya vs Senegal, Oman vs Ivory Coast, Saudi Arabia vs Algeria, November 18 5 p.m. UTC plus or minus 0, Chile vs Peru, Cyprus vs Estonia, Faroe Islands vs Kazakhstan, 7 p.m., Morocco vs Uganda, 7:30 p.m., Brazil vs Tunisia, 9 p.m. St. Kitts and Nevis vs Belize, November 18th 11 p.m. UTC plus or minus 0, Antigua and Barbuda vs Guyana, 11:30 p.m. Dominican Republic vs Martinique, November 19th 12 a.m. United States vs Uruguay, 12:30 a.m. Mexico vs Paraguay, 1 a.m. Colombia vs Australia, 1:30 a.m. Ecuador vs New Zealand. Thanks for watching. Please subscribe.